Camille Washington is probably the most beautiful girl I've ever seen in my life. So her acting ability, I think she won that Oscar or whatever. She was gorgeous, but at the wrong time, at the wrong place in the wrong time. Basically, she was not getting roles because of her race, which is probably a true reflection of that time period. That time period was the Jim Crow time period. It was the civil rights movement didn't start until the 1960s. That she was even in that position where she was potentially getting roles was probably inaccurate for an African American woman at that time period.
She was closer to getting to the roles than a lot of African American people would have actually been. Anyone of colour would not have been that close. And I know her initial roles were all just maids and domestic help and stuff, but I still think around that time it would have been more white people that still would have been getting those roles. We're probably not far away from the time where people were still doing the blackface to try and be a person of colour in movies.
Well, they did mention Song of the South, which was out in around that time period. Song of the South is probably the most racist movie that has ever been made. It's about a slave on a plantation who's really happy being a slave. It's a Disney movie, and he's sort of completely subservient to his white masters, and the happiest slave that could ever be happy is basically Song of the South. That wasn't the worst thing that would have been happening at that time. The Ku Klux Klan would have been very, very active at that time, and lynchings would have been very common.
Yeah.
It does. What I said before there about it painting a slightly more politically correct narrative of that time period is probably true. What I found interesting about Camille Washington is that whenever she played the maid, they kind of made her the comedic relief, kind of like she was a bit dumb, a bit stupid, a bit kind of that she wasn't to be taken seriously even in a serious movie, and that was very much how kind of ethnic people would have been treated at that time, as if sort of they were dumber than white people, as if they were kind of... And at that time, that is absolutely accurate. And it shows the true tragedy of racism, really, that my thoughts on race... I know that we grew up in Northern Ireland, and I grew up during the 1980s in Northern Ireland, and as a people in the 1980s and early 1990s in Northern Ireland, we were quite ignorant. We were not very worldly because of our problems here. I remember that racial slurs on the playground were pretty common. There weren't an awful lot of people of colour around. There weren't an awful lot of people who weren't from Northern Ireland around. We had next to no exposure of other ethnicities, and that has changed quite a lot, I suppose, over the last 10 years in Northern Ireland, but that is very, very recent. I think that contemporary political correctness are obviously better, but it rings home to me because I remember that those sort of words were flying around the playground as if they didn't mean anything, incendiary language about people that weren't there. The people, like, anyone ethnic wasn't on the playground, so there wasn't anybody to call us up on it. Asia seemed very far away. Africa seemed very far away. For the most part, Northern Irish people didn't travel that much during the Troubles because most people couldn't afford to. During the Troubles, there was a 40% unemployment rate in Northern Ireland. Today, it's 5%. So a lot of people in Northern Ireland were unemployed. A lot of people weren't travelling. Nobody particularly was coming to us from anywhere in Asia or Africa So we were an ignorant people unintentionally. We just didn't have the exposure to other ethnicities, and that would have been the 1940s back then. That there would have been that kind of ignorance and intolerance towards other ethnicities.
Yeah. What I like about what they did with this, though, is rather than just showing how awful it was, yes, they showed how hard it was for somebody to get a role, and they did show part of people protesting, and we had the crosses being burned in the garden, but you didn't see the real darkness of it, and we also didn't see the side of it where, for the most part, those actresses and actors would have just stepped back and went, okay, do you know what, this isn't worth it. I need to just shy away from this. Whereas what we saw was two different actresses who fought for their rights, who showed us this is what we should be doing. And it kind of rings true for every different minority, race, sexual gender, whatever you are. You know, it kind of rings true for all of that, that rather than just shying away from it, we should be breaking down those barriers. And I love that rather than just showing exactly what it was like in the 1940s, they showed us a wee bit more what a bit more progressive time could have.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. It's almost what we could have been as opposed to what we were, which kind of made me feel a sense of guilt for that time period. And not just because, as I say, in the 1980s, I as a child, and probably most people my age as a child, were not as tolerant as we should have been. And as I've become more tolerant and accepting as I've grown older, and I hope that I have, I feel as if I have, just through exposure, through meeting other people and talking to them, and understanding more about their cultures, and understanding that people of other ethnicities have all the same challenges we have, basically, you know, and
Yeah.
through exposure we do become more tolerant. And